You have to wear prom.
Oh, I have a vintage 80s
Oh.
pink poofy
Cool.
lacy ridiculousness to wear tonight. Figured I would not wear it to city.
Why not?
Maybe with
Well, today's prom, isn't it?
yeah, it's prom night.
That's originally why I was late before I ran into our gentleman on the front porch, because I had to at last minute, fill up the water for the steamer for prom dresses. So priorities.
Sorry. Right. Well, we have quorum in the room, and so, Mr. Clerk, would you call the roll again to reestablish the quorum?
Councilmember Brown.
Here.
Councilmember Henderson.
Here.
Councilmember Doug Johnson is excused. Councilmember Mark Johnson.
Here,
Councilmember Martinson is excused. Councilmember Topcott. Youth Representative Hebel. We have a quorum.
Thank you. And for the record, today is Friday, May 6th. The time is 5:40. After hearing or going through the agenda on getting some clarification and some additional supplemental information on 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 properties and fields. The applications for exemption were timely filed with the clerk, and the clerk has ruled on those, and so therefore Norton Sound would be appealing the decision of the clerk acting as city assessor with regard to these properties. The first property is tax lot 001.221.05A. In your original packet, that's at page 19, and supplemental information in the new packet on page 2. So I think the appellant did state their case at the last session, but Mr. Osborne and Ms. Pearson, we're going to give you an opportunity again just to ensure that after you've had an opportunity to review this, take any additional information from you. So the floor is yours.
Thank you. Good evening, everyone. This is Wendy. So I'm assuming since this is a continuation, you do not want me to repeat the sort of general hospital activities, general description of the hospital, and the particular utilization of this property, or would you like me to repeat all that?
No, I don't think you need to repeat all of that, but the usage associated with this particular property at block 91 lots 3 and 4, you would acquaint us with that use.
Sure. So this is a property that we call the 7 Plex. It's a building that houses doctors who are working at the hospital. The housing is offered to the doctors for free and has been a necessary incentive to attract qualified medical personnel. The housing is also legally required to be provided as part of the compact that I referred to on Wednesday, the Alaska Tribal Health Compact. One of the requirements of that agreement with Indian Health Services is to provide medical personnel housing. Approximately 2% of the time, that housing is, or that building is also used to house new hires to the hospital system. They're permitted to stay there for free for 30 days while looking for permanent housing. And then after that 30-day period, a nominal rent is charged for their stayover period. The hospital or Norton Sound does not generate a profit from that temporary rental to new hires. And we provided a financial report that identifies it operates that at a net loss. So that's and there's of course, a description of the use in your materials, but that's an overview. So why don't I reiterate what our position is on the statutory exemption under 2945 for hospital use, and then Steve can reiterate our position on the federal preemption. So it's our position that this particular building qualifies as the hospital, that it is by definition the hospital. We did cite the Alaska Attorney General opinion that indicates that related facilities, training facilities, central service facilities, and other buildings associated with the actual provision of care are deemed to be the hospital. Now, I know Mr. Hammond had mentioned the other night that that particular opinion may not be relevant because it related to a different statute. The Attorney General was citing the statute related to the Alaska Hospital and Medical Facilities Survey and Construction Act. And when reviewing the legislative intent of that act, the legislative intent was to define hospitals in that way, that broadly, for the construction of hospitals throughout the state. But the AG also went on to say that notwithstanding the purpose of that statute, the definition of hospital is generally understood to include the structures operated as part of a hospital complex, in addition to the limited area in which care is directly provided to patients. So the AG's opinion extends beyond the limited purpose of that particular statute and identifies the generally understood meaning of a hospital. Our position is that this particular property is exclusively used for hospital purposes. The exclusive use test is whether, in Alaska, is whether the use is a direct and primary use or direct and primary to the exempt purposes. That test, the direct and primary test, was cited in City of Nome versus Catholic Bishop of Northern Alaska, confirmed again in the Fairbanks North Star Borough case versus Dena'ina-Henash. So what is direct and primary use? In another Alaska case, Matanuska-Susitna Borough versus Kings Lake Camp, the court said direct and primary use is that which is incidental to and reasonably necessary for carrying out the primary charitable purposes. In the Greater Anchorage Borough versus Sisters of Charity case, the Alaska court said property which must be provided and utilized for purposes necessary to the functioning of the hospital is a direct and primary use. And in that case, the court was distinguishing property that was being leased to a third party or doctors for their private practice. In other jurisdictions that utilize similarly the exclusive use requirement for exemption, and where that exclusive use requirement is interpreted to mean the primary use. In Cedars of Lebanon Hospital versus Los Angeles, the court held that the provision of living quarters for resident doctors and hospital employees was institutionally necessary. And then the Sisters of Charity court, the Alaska court, essentially agreed with that and said, in this case, in Sisters of Charity, where we're saying that a hospital that leases office space to a third party for their private practice, we're saying that that's not exempt. But we are not deciding, and this is in footnote 12, we are not deciding whether a hospital is entitled to an exemption for space, in this case office, that must be provided in order to secure the doctor's services necessary to the functioning of the hospital. And finally, direct and primary use is determined to be that which is reasonably necessary to effectuate the hospital purposes. And that's from, again, a number of jurisdictions with the same test as Alaska. So for this, what we call the 7-plex, is our position that the housing is reasonably necessary to effectuate the hospital purposes. It is not being used to generate income. It is not being used for an unrelated purpose. It has effectively been as I mentioned, legally required to be provided, and functions legally required by the hospital to undertake, and for which its federal exemption was granted, are by definition the direct and primary purpose of the hospital and its exemption. Again, as the Sisters of Charity Court said, exemption is warranted when the property must be provided and utilized for the purposes necessary to the functioning of the hospital. And then finally, I would say, with respect to Mr. Hammond's determination, he determined that the housing would not be exempt because it's not vitally necessary to the operation of the hospital. We submit that the vitally necessary standard is not the appropriate standard, that as the City of Nome versus Catholic Bishop Court said, the standard is whether it's direct and primary, or whether the use is direct and primary to the exempt purposes. In that Catholic Bishop case, they were addressing a narrow exception to the exclusive use rule. And they said that the direct and primary standard is the appropriate standard, but there's two narrow exceptions, and one of them is where the property is used for purposes directly incidental to and vitally necessary for the exempt use of quote unquote other property. And in that case, the other property was property used for parsonage. And so that the Catholic Bishop Court basically said the vitally necessary standard is applied only in that narrow exception for the use of other property. But notwithstanding that, even for argument's sake, if we use the vitally necessary standard, again, functions that the hospital is legally required to undertake. So the hospital is legally required to provide the housing in this doctor's housing in this case. It is by definition then an explicit and integral part of its exempt purpose and vitally necessary. To hold otherwise really would just abrogate its exempt purpose entirely. So that is our position on the exclusive use and the statutory tax exemption. And so I'll pass it on to Steve for the federal preemption.
Thank you, Wendy. Go ahead, Steve.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you. Good evening. Even if the 7-plex is not exempt based on the state law that Wendy just discussed, we have an alternative argument that the tax is preempted by federal law under the implied federal preemption doctrine, which holds that properties used to carry out federal government functions, essentially government programs and activities that are comprehensively and pervasively regulated by the federal government, are essentially federal property for tax purposes and cannot be taxed by state and local governments. Here we have a Norton Sound carrying out an Indian Self-Determination Act compact and funding agreement, comprehensively regulated by the Indian Health Service and other federal authorities in the ways that I described last week, or not that long ago, just on Wednesday. And we think that this is kind of a textbook case of the federal preemption, and there's the analogous case in Alaska is the Ketchikan Gateway Borough versus Ketchikan Indian Corporation case involving a health clinic funded by the Indian Health Service under the Indian Self-Determination Act. And there was no question in that case that the space in the building at issue that was used to carry out the health clinic functions was exempt under the implied federal preemption doctrine. The only question in the case was whether the unused or vacant space was also exempt, and the Alaska Supreme Court held that it was not. There was a dissent, but the majority ruled that the vacant space was not because the corporation had no clear plan to incorporate that space into the services that they were carrying out under the Self-Determination Act agreement. By contrast, here, Norton Sound does have clear plans to utilize these currently vacant spaces for activities within the scope of their federal agreement with the Indian Health Service, and those are laid out in the application. So we think that not only the 7-plex, which we're talking about right now, but all of the other properties at issue tonight are exempt under this implied federal preemption doctrine.
Thank you. And just to confirm, you were making a statement on vacant properties, but this particular property is not vacant, correct?
That's right.
Okay. Was there anything further from the appellant or those that are in the room? Okay. Mr. Hammond, would you reiterate or restate the basis for your decision?
Okay, I would argue that the federal preemption doctrine is irrelevant here because of the instrumentality of the federal government. This argument was explicitly rejected by the Superior Court in the Ketchikan v. Arctic Native Brotherhood, Arctic Native Sisterhood case, and that was later upheld by the Supreme Court. Furthermore, I would also argue that sovereign immunity, that argument is not relevant to this discussion at hand. The sovereign immunity precludes the city's ability to foreclose on delinquent taxes through suit. It does not preclude taxation and levying of a tax. Those taxes follow the property, and if that property should ever be sold, those taxes will be due and owing.
Thank you. We also have our counsel on the line, Mr. Chandler. Do you have any guidance to provide to the board?
Yes, if you'd like legal advice from me, you have the option of having that provided either in public or in executive session, since it would be a privileged communication between the attorney and the board. So before I just go blabbing away here, I at least want to make sure, A, you are aware of that, and B, have you consider whether you wanted advice provided in the public forum or in an executive session. Okay,
thank you for that. We will then put that request in abeyance at this point and continue with taking testimony then on the next parcel. And then we will come back to actually meet with our council, I think, as opposed to going in and out, in and out, in and out of executive session.
Okay.
So we will then, agreement of the board, we will move on then to the next parcel, which is tax lot 001.201.05. And this is block 127, lot 7A.
Which, I'm trying to figure out which properties there, like I think the sevenplex is the old lawyer's apartment.
Correct.
And then what's the next one?
Uh,
The common description.
The Brian, can you provide the common description of the
This should be the West Campus, I believe.
Warehouses, the old warehouses and, okay.
and this does not include the behavioral, the old Northern Lights Recovery Center building, because that's on a separate appeal number. So it would be the old Engstrom garage stuff back there in the back. Okay, we would then welcome comments on or testimony on your case on this appeal. If there is information that you previously stated, will allow you to simply reference that as opposed to saying it all over again for each of the parcels.
Perfect. Wonderful. Thank you. Well, let me just describe the use of this building then very quickly. So the West Campus has three principal uses. One is for the storage of essential records. So there is no storage in the hospital. It's every square foot is dedicated to the care facility. So there's having no other place to store essential records, they're stored here. These are records that the hospital is legally required to maintain. They include HR records and finance records and medical records. And the period of time during which they have to maintain these is anywhere from 7 years to the full lifespan of a former employee, however long that may be. So you could imagine that the records sort of version over time. There's also a vehicle and facility maintenance in the other half of the building. So one half is the record storage, the other half vehicle and facility maintenance. So the trucks, the snow plows, the heavy equipment all kept and maintained there. And then the physical plant operations for the whole hospital campus, training for that is conducted in this building throughout the year. So again, our position is that this is the hospital. It's not other or ancillary property. Citing again to the AG's opinion that it includes hospital includes central service facilities and training facilities. We believe that this property is exclusively used for those hospital purposes. Again, I won't cite all the cases, but the general test being that it's reasonably necessary to carrying out the charitable purpose. In this case, it's necessary to maintain documents that they're legally required to maintain and to have a place to maintain equipment so that the hospital can be cared for in a safe and timely manner with this equipment. One case that we cited in our materials, again from a jurisdiction that has an exclusive use requirement that's defined also as the primary, direct and primary use. In a case by the name of Norwegian American Hospital versus Department of Revenue in Illinois, the court stated that the hospital, this was for ancillary or auxiliary property offsite. The court stated that the hospital need not prove that the subject parcels involved activity directly related to the healing of patients in order to receive the tax exemption. So again, the test being, is this reasonably necessary to effectuate the hospital purposes? Is it necessary for the functioning of the hospital? We submit that it is. We have the same position as to the vitally necessary standard being the improper standard to utilize. Again, the test is whether this is direct and primary to the exempt purposes. And what we'd submit about properties like this, which are offsite, is there is no standalone separate purpose for them. They have no function outside of a hospital function. They wouldn't be there doing anything separate if there weren't a hospital. So by definition, they're integrated into the hospital activities and necessary for its functioning. So that's all that we would have to say additionally, and I would incorporate our additional citations and arguments from my earlier statements about the 7 Plex, and of course we have our citations in the appeal material for your reference.
Thank you. For the record, this particular property was assigned appeal number 24 by the assessor. The material in the original packet is contained in pages 135 to 262 inclusive. And the supplemental material is in the second packet is on pages 6 through 9 inclusive. Mr. Hammond.
My reason for denying this
Excuse me
exemption.
just a second. Steve, did you have something to add?
I did have just one thing to add. I won't repeat my whole argument again, but Mr. Hammond mentioned the Ketchikan versus Arctic Native Brotherhood and Sisterhood case where the courts did not apply the federal preemption doctrine, which is true, but that was a very different case. It was not an Indian Self-Determination Act case. In that case, the corporation was carrying out educational and cultural activities. The property was essentially used as a community center and providing wonderful activities, but none of which were comprehensively and pervasively regulated by the federal government, like Norton Sound's Self-Determination Act properties are in this case. That's all. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Okay, back to you, Mr. Hammond.
So the reason I denied the West Campus is because it is not a hospital use as strictly construed by Alaska statute. Patients are not seen there. That's a required storage, but it is not a hospital use. It is not vitally necessary to the operation of the hospital, but it is conveniently necessary. So I looked up the language in a Catholic bishop, and at the end of section A is, in sum, we acknowledge that property may be exempt under AS 2953020A if the taxpayer establishes that the use of that property is directly incidental to and vitally necessary for the exempt use of other specifically identified property. I don't quite understand where the reasonably necessary comes from, because they are applying the vitally necessary standard. And I argue that the vitally necessary standard is the correct standard in this case. With respect to the 1983 KIC versus Articles of Brotherhood, Articles of Sisterhood, the case was similar enough that I feel that the Superior Court summarily rejected this argument, finding that it to be the least deserving of extended discussion. I agree. And similarly, they were looking at a spatially apportioned. They were looking at spatial apportionment and claiming that the federal instrumentality was enough to provide for exemption from taxation. I can't argue to the self-determination compact. I thought I had that highlighted, but the KIC is a reasonably analogous entity to NSHC, and as argued by one of our attorneys that is not here, KIC is actually probably more eligible of exemption, legal protection from taxation than Norton Sound is.
Thank you. I missed asking one other question here in the prior property, but the determination was made that there was no space apportionment, and this your decision applied to 100% of the property.
That is correct. It's not a hospital use. It's not being seen. Patients are not being seen there.
Okay, so that is for tax lot 001-22105A, and the same for 001-201.05. Okay, if there's nothing further on that property, we will move on then to tax lot 001.131.01A, which is block 33, lot 19. In our original packet, appeal number 25 in 263 is 397 inclusive, and in the supplemental, page 10 through 13 inclusive, and the common name or description for this is Kusky House. Wendy.
Yes, okay, so the Kusky House, now this one's has a little bit of a different and important fact. This property was deeded to Norton Sound from the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. That deed includes covenants that run with the property, covenants requiring the property to be used for quote unquote continuously for health purposes. So to that end, the building is used exclusively and continuously to house individuals who travel to Nome from the outer villages to receive emergency medical care training, health aid training, federally mandated training for Indian Health Services CHAP program. And it also temporarily houses visiting medical and contract staff from the outer villages. So similarly, as with the other properties, we maintain that the housing is, by definition, the hospital. It is integral to its operation and part of its operation. It is used exclusively for hospital purposes. Again, it's the test is whether its use is direct and primary to the hospital exempt purposes. There are a number of cases which we've cited that housing the doctors and medical staff and other hospital staff is institutionally necessary. And as a matter of fact, in the Sisters of Charity case in Alaska, the court stated that if it's institutionally necessary to be provided as a function, or necessary to be provided as a function of the hospital, then it's exempt. As with the other buildings, due to the compact with Indian Health Services, the housing is required to be maintained. And this is integrated also with the requirement in the contract that the hospital provide training to persons in the outer areas, outer villages, or within that 44,000 square mile service area that I had noted on Wednesday. So this is sort of twofold. It's a requirement to house medical staff, but it's also related to the requirement to provide training to people coming in from the service area. There would be no other way to provide the training unless the housing were provided. So it's necessary to the functioning of the hospital, as is the required test for direct and primary or exclusive use. And I believe we also cited some additional cases in our material, one being Abbott Northwestern Hospital, that temporary housing to train medical personnel is considered to be an exempt hospital use. And as I mentioned, there's really the use of this property is interdependent with the hospital. It has no independent function from the hospital, so it's integrated with the care. It's integrated with its operation as a tax-exempt entity. Its bylaws, in fact, require or state that it will provide training. So this is part of its. This is one of the reasons it was given a federal tax exemption, is related to not only the hospital care, but the training of medical personnel and others. So again, this property is integral to that exempt activity. One further comment I'd have with respect to Mr. Hammond's position that the vitally necessary standard is the correct standard. He did cite the Catholic bishop case. And again, I want to reiterate, the Catholic bishop case was defining a narrow exception to the exclusive use standard. And earlier to that quote from cited by Mr. Hammond, the court said that all uses of the property must be for the direct and primary exempt use. That is the test for exclusive use. And then in defining two narrow exceptions, the court said one of those narrow exceptions applies to other property outside of the actual, in this case, church. So the other property was related to parsonage allowance, and that was a narrow additional exception, statutory exception. And so the court said the only way that this other property would also be exempt is if it's vitally necessary. Here in this case, the Kuski housing and the other medical housing, it is it's direct and primary part of the operation of the hospital. It is not other property, it is hospital property. So we submit that, again, that the vitally necessary standard doesn't apply, but even if it did, Because the hospital is legally required to provide this housing, it's part of its stated exempt purpose in its bylaws. It is by definition vitally necessary. It can't function without doing that. It can't deliver on its exempt purposes and charitable purposes without that property. And that's all that I would have to say about the Husky House.
Thank you. Steve, did you have anything on that?
No, nothing new or different.
Okay, to confirm, you have some covenants associated with the acceptance of this deed, this property from DHHS that run for a period of 30 years. This 30-year period began, it appears, in May of 2002. So 2/3 of that period has now elapsed. And so I guess just of note that some of the covenants, they are applicable today, but in 10 years they would not be. And then the note and the testimony was that rent cannot be charged because of the conveyance. And just to confirm that the last sentence says rent is not charged to any employee staying at this location. And that would cover the people in the first sentence. But it also houses visiting doctors, nurses, various agencies referred to as contract labor and locums. And no rent is charged to contract labor or locums either, correct?
Yes, that's my understanding. I believe we have someone from the Norton Sound there that could confirm as well.
That's correct.
They're answering that in the affirmative. Okay, thank you. Mr. Hammond.
With respect to Kuski House, again, I argue that this is not a hospital. Patients are not being seen here. It is conveniently necessary to the operation of Norton Sound, but it is not vitally necessary. The argument that if housing was not provided, then they could not operate is untrue, because there are businesses in town that do sell transient housing. There are hotels and other accommodations. There are landlords, apartment buildings, and other ways of establishing housing, albeit difficult, but there are other ways of establishing housing in Nome. So it is conveniently necessary to the operation of a hospital, but it is not vitally necessary.
Thank you. And this determination is based on 100% of the assessed valuation and footprint.
Correct. And if I could just cite another case, there is the 2003 Ketchikan Gateway versus Ketchikan Indian Corporation. And in this case, the Superior Court applied the implied federal preemption doctrine to exempt from borough taxes all space in that building that contains a privately operated clinic that is subject to oversight by the Indian Health Service. The narrow question presented before the Alaska Supreme Court was whether space in a building that is not committed to use by the clinic should be exempt. They answer in the negative, because such space is not necessarily part of a pervasively and comprehensively regulated federal program, and the borough's interest in taxing the property is not inconsequential. I feel that that's an analogous case to the one at hand.
Okay, thank you.
I guess I would respond that the empty space is not necessarily part of the exempt use, as the court said, but under the right facts, it could be necessary to the exempt use. And I think the facts here with Norton Sound and their detailed plans for those currently unoccupied spaces are quite different from the Ketchikan case, where the corporation was looking to actually lease the space out to third party. Thank you.
Yeah, and I think specifically as to Kusky House, one other distinction is that, again, with the compact with Indian Health Services, between Norton Sound and Indian Health Services, requires it to provide training and to provide housing, to provide that particular training for those people at that stay at Kusky House, and to provide housing.
And Kusky House is currently occupied.
Yes.
Thank you. Councilmember Henderson.
And I think this question's for Wendy, and you may have mentioned it earlier, and I just want to clarify my understanding. Regarding the housing that Norton Sound owns, that Norton Sound is claiming is vitally necessary to the operation of the hospital, whether they house doctors or nurses or traveling healthcare aides, or even, I think, patients traveling in from in the region. And because those are vitally necessary to the operation of the hospital, the argument is made that they should be tax exempt. Is that argument also applicable to leased facilities or leased buildings or leased apartments from private entities that have leases that are essentially housing the exact same types of employees that are vitally necessary to the hospital? Is that, and you may have addressed this earlier and I didn't catch it, but would the owners of these particular properties, I think when Angie was here on Wednesday, I think she said there was maybe about 70 leases in the community that were leased at various capacities, I'm assuming similar to these buildings. Can that argument also then be made by these 70 other potentially leaseholders to say that because their properties hold or house these vitally necessary folks, are they also tax exempt as well?
Yeah. No, I would say not. And I think one of the major distinctions is that those properties are being leased for a profit, right? It's not property being used for the hospital purposes. It's property being leased by someone for a profit. That's different from these particular properties, the subject properties that are owned by the hospital. The utilization of those properties is integrated into the actual hospital operation. So if the hospital has to provide training, the training has to occur for people coming from outside of Nome. It's in proximity to the facility. It is conducive to the training, but also, again, pursuant to the compact, it helps the hospital fulfill its legal obligation to provide the housing and to provide the training. But it would not be other taxpayers renting out for a profit to the hospital would still be taxable properties.
So, okay, follow up. So even if Norton Sound were to construct housing, additional housing, and this is just a theoretical example, if Norton Sound were to say, okay, we're going to construct our own housing to fulfill a housing shortage in the community, and as a result of that, end up canceling, or once their own housing, not leasing as many of those same buildings, I would expect that Norton Sound would then claim similar tax exemption on the new construction that they're building, which maybe formerly were leased out. And I guess that question is stuck in my head, that this argument that you're making, if it's leased from a private landlord, it's not tax exempt. But if it's used for exactly the same purpose but owned by Norton Sound, then it is tax exempt. And I'm not an attorney, but I'm trying to understand that difference.
Right. Yeah. So it's property. So it would be different if, for instance, I think it was in the Sisters of Charity case, where the Sisters of Providence had a piece of property and they leased it out to private doctors. Well, that leasing activity was not an activity related to hospital use. It was a commercial activity. So it wouldn't have been exempt, that particular even though it was owned by the hospital, it wasn't hospital activity. If Norton Sound acquires what has been privately owned property and takes ownership of it and integrates it into their hospital and makes it part of their hospital activity, and their hospital activity includes the provision of care, it includes the administration that supports that care, it includes the provision of necessary housing for doctors, nurses, and others visiting from the service area. It includes training facilities, which again they're obligated to conduct. So if it's part of that hospital activity, then it's exclusive hospital use. If it's commercial, it's not exclusive hospital use.
I'm not an attorney, but that I have difficulty following that. And I'll use the example. I'm assuming that the 7-plex was formerly privately owned. And I'm assuming, I could be wrong, that Norton Sound leased either that facility or a portion of that facility for the same purposes that it is using it for now. Obviously, when it was under private ownership, it was not tax exempt. Once Norton Sound acquires ownership of that same building, uses it for exactly the same purposes, it is now tax exempt. That's what's causing me the confusion. But I don't mean to belabor the point.
Yeah. It's a good question, but probably doesn't fit under this particular thing. And it's certainly an answer we would love to know.
Okay. That's all. Thank you, John.
Thank you. We will move on then to 001.115.01, which is block 116 and a big new nice lot 1A that's all encompassing of the block. So that takes in the hostel, the wellness center, and the operations building, one that across from. For the record, the materials associated with this appeal are in original packet 398 to 523 inclusive. And in the supplemental, pages 14 through 17 inclusive. Wendy, back to you.
Okay. So the hostel. So this, I think this was, this is a portion of property that was the portion that was not exempted by Mr. Hammond. So this it includes a building used entirely for patient housing, which we call the hostel. There's a blueprint, I think, in your material, so you could kind of see what we're talking about. It has a west wing and an east wing. The east wing was historically devoted to pre-admission maternity patients. However, during COVID, to address the COVID-19 public health emergency, the east wing had been used for isolation and quarantine of COVID-19 patients. This will continue as needed throughout the duration of the public health emergency. The west wing is used for general pre-admission of patients to the hospital, and it is used at times also for isolation of COVID-19 patients. Now this houses patients who are traveling from the hospital's service area in the Bering Strait area. Alternative housing generally is unavailable to them, but often these patients lack the resources to obtain alternative housing. And you could see from the community health needs assessment that we included, the service area for these patients is very large, 44,000 square miles. So it's necessary to provide a means for the patients to have easy access to care. And again, Norton Sound is legally required in the compact with Indian Health Services to provide patient housing. So the stay at the hostel is actually integrated into the patient care. Patients at the hospital receive pre and post admission support, including 3 meals per day provided by the hospital. It's directly across from the hospital facility, so it provides immediate access to care. And the average length of stay is approximately 2 to 3 days. So again, our position is that this is the hospital. It's not another ancillary property. It is an integral part of the hospital, consistent with the Alaska Attorney General's definition. One case that we cited that perhaps may in some part answer the councilman's earlier question. Altman Hospital Association versus Abbott, again, a jurisdiction that has an exclusive use requirement interpreted to be the primary use. The court reasoned that the hospital would not cease to qualify for an exemption if its nurses slept at the hospital. The fact that it utilizes property within the vicinity of the hospital to house them still makes it a necessary part of the hospital operation and allows them to carry out the hospital work. Again, there are a number of cases which hold, a number of jurisdictions which hold that the hospital patient housing is an exempt use. It's actually a hospital, defined as part of the hospital. And again, citing Sisters of Charity, it's essential to the operation and reasonably necessary to effectuate the hospital purposes. One additional information about the hospital. I think it's important to note when considering that this is a hospital property, it's important to note that the care of the patient is integrated with the hostel, and the hospital care is integrated. They get pre and post admission assistance there at the hostel. It's close so that they can have access to their doctors easily and quickly. And so again, that would be additional factors that would make it part of its direct and primary purpose and essential to supporting its direct and primary purpose. I think we've said enough about the vitally necessary standard not being the appropriate standard, even by the case of Catholic Bishop, and a case following Catholic Bishop several years later said that the test is direct and primary use, not vitally necessary use. And in that later case, Fairbanks North Star, actually the court declined to apply the vitally necessary standard or test and applied the direct and primary test. So that is really the only additional analysis that I would offer on the patient hostel.
Thank you. And this is being limited to the patient hostel because the other parcels on the block have all been granted 100% exemption?
That is correct.
Okay. All right, Steve, did you have anything there?
No, nothing additional for me.
Okay, Mr. Hammond.
So as Wendy said, this is spatially apportioned, exempting the wing where COVID patients are being actively treated. Housing for patients is, as I've argued, not a hospital use and not eligible for exemption. This property does make convenient and inexpensive housing for patients prior to admission, but it is not a hospital use, nor is it vitally necessary to hospital use. Patients in Nome, patients who are Nome residents are not required to stay in this hospital or in this hostel prior to going to the hospital. If it was vitally necessary, wouldn't you expect a patient, regardless of where they live, to have to pass through this property. Benefit C states that the purpose is devoted entirely to housing patients cheaply and close to the hospital. This is a laudable use and it's very beneficial to our region. However, it does not exempt the property from taxation.
Thank you. Okay, we will move to tax lot 001.241-54. This is block 30, lots 66 and 67, which is known as the Eia Building here on First Avenue. Wendy.
So this property is vacant. As one of the pieces of property that were deeded to Norton Sound Health from HHS in 2006. Covenants on the use of the property also for continuously for health purposes. And it was used, I think behavioral services was in this building until 2020. And those functions have been moved to the block 116, lot 1A. Now, I think what's quite different from all the other properties here is that this property was voted by the board of Norton Sound Health to be deeded back to HHS, and that is in process. And I don't know the current status. Maybe someone there can update on the status, but there was some expectation that the federal government would have ownership of the property again by this month.
Yeah, but on January 1, 2022, that's the date,
Okay.
the property was owned by Norton Sound Health Corporation.
Correct. But at some point in May or thereabouts, it will be owned by the federal government.
Okay. Steve?
Well, I guess you could argue that the fact that this property is subject to covenants imposed by HHS strengthens the argument that it is subject to the kind of pervasive regulation of the federal government that would support a implied preemption argument. Other than that, nothing else.
Okay, thank you. And this here, 100% taxable based on the assessor's determination.
Correct.
And you talked about this one?
Yes, so as Wendy mentioned, this property is vacant. It was owned by Norton Sound on January 1st, 2022. A vacant property is not strictly a hospital use. It is not being used. And it was not being used on January 1st, 2021. It was vacant. So under the strict construction of Alaska Statute 2945030, this is not eligible for.
Okay. That brings us to,
I have a real quick
Please.
question on that property. I'm just curious, was it exempt at any point in the last 5-6 years?
I believe so.
Okay.
I'd have to-
Yes.
It was. So the change in use to a vacant property is what triggered the taxable status. I see. Thanks.
all right, then moving to tax lot 001.211.03A, which is block 110, lots 1 and 2, commonly known as the BHS or Northern Lights Recovery Center building in Division Street.
Okay, back to me.
Yeah, and just for the record, the
Okay.
packet is appeal number 28, going from page 656 to 775 inclusive, and supplemental pages 22 through 25 inclusive. Now to you. Thank you, Wendy.
So prior to this year, the building was used for training and behavioral health services. Again, a service that was moved to Lot 116, Block 1A in the latter part of 2021. It was leased for some time to the public health system. So it was leased to another tax exempt entity. I think the rule, it was exempt during that period because when you lease to another tax exempt entity, you still have an exempt use. So it's vacant right now. It will be used to expand the health care services, probably or possibly for temporary housing for maternal health patients or overflow patients. There is an intent, of course, to use it only for hospital purposes, no purpose unrelated to the hospital core purposes. And for this and the other vacant property, we don't disagree with Mr. Hammond on a vacant property would not qualify under 2945.030 because it's not being used. But we do submit that the federal preemption still applies to these properties.
Thank you. And it is vacant today. Was it vacant on January 1, 2022?
Yes.
Thank you. Steve?
No, Wendy's right. The fact that it's vacant does not affect the preemption argument in our view. In the Ketchikan Gateway Borough case, the dissent had an excellent discussion of vacant space, and I think a more thoughtful analysis of how to look at vacant space than the majority opinion. But the key difference even from the majority opinion's analysis and the case here is that this property will be used, as Wendy said, to expand the hospital core purposes. And so it really is being used to carry out the federal program, not immediately, but imminently. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. And this is 100% taxable, according to the assessor.
Correct.
Go ahead, Mr. Hammond.
So like the last one, intending to use something is not using something. It must be exclusively charitable or nonprofit hospital use to be exempt under Alaska statute 2945.030. And I disagree on the federal preemption.
Okay. That then completes the hearing on these 6 properties. And unless there are any other open questions at this point, we are going to, I'm going to request a motion to recess into executive session with counsel to receive guidance or not instruction, but information from our counsel with regard to.
I have one more question that shouldn't take more than a minute.
Sure.
That's, my question is on the housing for the doctors and other medical personnel, whether they be itinerant or otherwise, are they required to stay in the corporate housing, or is it an option for them to stay elsewhere if they so choose?
Well, I'll let, I think some other representatives there from Norton Sound add to my comments here, but I think what's important to know about certainly the doctor's housing is that it's provided for free. So it's a necessary incentive to attract qualified medical personnel. So I suppose they could, go find another place, but they're not likely to do that when they're given housing for free as an incentive to have them locate in this remote area to provide essential care. The other thing about the housing, both the temporary and the semi-permanent, if you will, is that its proximity to the hospital is conducive to the hospital functions. They're there. They're on 24-hour call at times, and they're on rotations where they can't really leave for an extended period of time. So their proximity to the hospital is very important. So, and the same is for those coming from the outside villages for the essential emergency medical training and health aid training, and their proximity to the hospital, the core hospital facility is again conducive to them receiving that training, being available imminently for needed care and other core functions of the hospital.
Okay, thanks. I guess that would, to me, that sounds like it's a component of compensation for those doctors that are able to take advantage of it. Thanks. Move to go into executive session if nobody else has any objections.
Yeah, is there a second? Okay, Councilmember Brown and Councilmember Henderson. I am going to suggest that we will spend 30 minutes only in this. If it requires additional time due to some time commitments by others, that we will recess at 7:20 and have to pick this back up, say, Monday at 5.
We have a work session at 5:30.
Right, so we do it before and then just push the work session a little bit. Is that agreeable to everybody? Okay. All right, without objection, we are in executive session. And should we be coming back on the record to vote on these appeals this evening, can we please ensure that we have telephone numbers to make contact with people? You'll hear from us within 30 minutes, or it will be Monday.
John?
Okay. Sorry, just to be clear, you want a phone number? You want us to go ahead and log off and give us a call when you want us to log back on?
Yeah, just a minute, Debbie.
Yeah, I was gonna say I could give you my number and then I could communicate with Wendy.
Okay, Debbie will communicate with you too. Debbie,
Great.
Okay, perfect.
right. Thank you.
So
All right, we'll sign off.
And
907
Thank you.
0505.
050. Okay, great. And you'll call Dan or?
Yep.
Okay, sounds great. Okay, we got one more to disconnect. Okay,
Want me in here? Or do you want me to?
yeah, absolutely, you can stay. Okay.